The scorching sun of Cartagena de Indias, 1700 AD, beat down on the cobblestone streets, bustling with merchants, sailors, and the glittering promise of a wealthy future. Don Alejandro Vargas, a young and ambitious underwater archaeologist, observed the port's activity with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Rumors about the latest Spanish treasure fleet, laden with gold, silver, and jewels from the New World colonies, dominated conversations. The fleet, led by the galleon El Sueño de Castilla, was expected to depart soon, but a strange mist of uncertainty hung in the air. That morning, an urgent messenger from Madrid had arrived with direct orders for Don Alejandro. The Spanish crown, aware of his reputation as one of the most promising in the field of maritime archaeology, wished for him to accompany the fleet. The official mission was to document the route and the treasure transport procedures, an unprecedented effort for the time. However, a secret note, delivered to him by a trusted contact, hinted at a darker purpose. "Vigilance, Don Alejandro. There are whispers of betrayal." Don Alejandro walked to the pier where the last barrels of provisions were being loaded onto the ships. The scent of salt and pitch mingled with the sweet aroma of spices and the pungent smell of livestock. He observed the faces of the sailors, some young and optimistic, others older, with scars that told tales of storms and battles. Among them, he noticed a group of men with stern expressions and evasive eyes. They seemed to always be together, whispering among themselves, and Don Alejandro felt a chill down his spine. Upon boarding El Sueño de Castilla, Don Alejandro was greeted by Captain Ramirez, a burly man with a face marked by time and the elements. The captain, though respectful, seemed distant, his blue eyes observing Don Alejandro's every move with veiled curiosity. "Welcome aboard, Don Alejandro," Ramirez said in a hoarse voice. "We hope your presence brings good fortune to our journey. This fleet carries the future of Spain." On board, Don Alejandro began to organize his equipment: compasses, detailed maps, clipboards, and the rudimentary depth-measuring instruments of the era. He knew his true task went beyond documentation. He needed to identify the veiled threat the secret note hinted at. As night fell, while the ship swayed gently on the dark waters, the young archaeologist reviewed the documents in his cabin, his mind swirling with possibilities. The fleet was about to depart, carrying not only the treasure of a nation, but also a secret that could change the course of history. He felt that the journey would be long and dangerous, and that the greatest treasures would not be found at the bottom of the ocean, but rather unearthed from the hearts of men. If you're enjoying this adventure full of mystery and emotion, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. The first days of the voyage unfolded under a relentless sun and favorable winds. The fleet, composed of a dozen merchant ships and escorted by several warships, advanced majestically through the blue Caribbean waters. Don Alejandro spent his mornings studying ocean currents and underwater rock formations, while afternoons were dedicated to observing the crew and other passengers. He tried discreetly to identify who might be involved in the alleged betrayal. The men he had noticed in Cartagena, a group led by a cold-eyed individual named Mateo, kept to themselves, avoiding interaction with the rest of the crew. They communicated in whispers and seemed constantly alert. Don Alejandro noticed that Mateo frequently met with some of the younger, more impressionable sailors, and suspected he was recruiting new members for his cause. One evening during dinner in the main hall of El Sueño de Castilla, an incident occurred. A drunken sailor bumped into Mateo, spilling wine on his tunic. Mateo reacted with disproportionate fury, grabbing the sailor by the collar and uttering low, frightening threats. Captain Ramirez quickly intervened, breaking up the fight, but the incident served to heighten the tension on the ship. Don Alejandro observed the scene, his distrust of Mateo solidifying. In the following days, the weather began to change. Dark, ominous clouds appeared on the horizon, foreshadowing a storm. The sea, previously calm, became agitated, with increasingly large waves crashing against the ship's hulls. The crew worked tirelessly to prepare the vessels for the bad weather, tying down sails and securing the cargo. Don Alejandro, while helping to protect some of his more delicate instruments, overheard fragments of a conversation between two sailors. They spoke of a secret map, an alternative route that Matteo supposedly possessed, which would allegedly take them to a different destination than planned. The information, though fragmented, confirmed Don Alejandro's suspicions. The betrayal seemed to be underway, and the impending storm could be the catalyst for the execution of the plan. As night fell, with lightning slicing through the sky and thunder echoing like cannons, the wind howled through the ship's ropes. Don Alejandro felt El Sueño de Castilla rock violently under the force of the waves. He knew that the real battle would not be against the elements, but against the cunning and greed of men. The fleet was about to enter the heart of the storm, and Don Alejandro felt that the fate of the treasure fleet hung by a thread. The storm broke out with full force. Furious winds ripped through the sails, and gigantic waves swallowed the ships, tossing them back and forth like toys. The roar of the wind and the thunder of the sea were deafening, and the darkness of the night was broken only by the lightning that momentarily illuminated the chaotic scene. Panic began to spread among the crew and passengers. Don Alejandro, clinging to a mast to avoid being thrown overboard, observed the chaos. The skill of the sailors, accustomed to such weather, was tested to the maximum. Captain Ramirez, despite the seriousness of the situation, remained calm, issuing loud and clear orders, trying to maintain order amidst the confusion. However, amidst the storm, Don Alejandro noticed a strange movement. Matteo's group, instead of helping to control the ship, seemed to be heading towards the bow, towards the map room. Suspecting the worst, Don Alejandro decided to follow them, taking advantage of the commotion to avoid being noticed. The ship groaned and creaked under the impact of the waves, and every step was a struggle against the rocking and tilting. As he approached the map room, Don Alejandro heard agitated voices. Matteo argued with one of the navigation officers, demanding that the route be changed. "This is the moment," he shouted above the sound of the storm. "No one will suspect with this chaos." The officer, initially hesitant, seemed to be yielding to the pressure. Don Alejandro realized that they were about to divert the fleet to the secret route he had heard about. Suddenly, a terrifying crash shook the ship. El Sueño de Castilla hit something submerged, perhaps a coral reef or an uncharted rock. A collective scream of horror echoed through the vessel. Water began to pour rapidly through a breach in the hull, and the ship tilted dangerously. The map room was flooded with water, and Matteo, in a panic, tried to save the secret map. But the document slipped from his hands and was carried away by the current, disappearing into the darkness. The priority now was not the treasure, but survival. Don Alejandro saw Matteo and his accomplices disperse, trying to find lifeboats. Captain Ramirez, realizing the extent of the damage, gave the order to abandon ship. Complete chaos ensued, with people running in all directions, desperate to escape the sinking ship. Don Alejandro, amidst the confusion, spotted a group of sailors loyal to the captain struggling to launch one of the boats. He knew he had to reach them if he wanted any chance of surviving and, more importantly, of unraveling what had truly happened to the treasure fleet. The storm was not just a natural phenomenon. It had become an ally for betrayal, and now a gravedigger for El Sueño de Castilla. El Sueño de Castilla was in its death throes. Water engulfed every compartment, and the ship sank rapidly, dragging down with it the dreams and riches of a nation. Don Alejandro, with the help of some loyal sailors, managed to reach one of the last lifeboats being launched into the sea. Captain Ramirez, though injured, supervised the evacuation, ensuring that as many people as possible could escape. The chaos on the surface was indescribable. Cries of despair mingled with the roar of the storm. Other ships in the fleet also seemed to be in trouble, their flickering lights disappearing one by one into the darkness, swallowed by the gigantic waves. Don Alejandro's boat rocked violently, and he had to cling firmly to the edges to avoid being thrown into the cold, treacherous water. Among the survivors in the boat were Captain Ramirez, some sailors, and a terrified young cabin boy. Don Alejandro tried to calm the cabin boy, while the captain, with a choked voice, tried to formulate a survival plan. "We need to stay calm," Ramirez said, coughing. "The storm will pass. We need to stick together." The hours that followed were a battle against the elements. Rain lashed their faces, and the intense cold began to numb their bodies. Hope diminished with each passing minute. Don Alejandro looked at the dark horizon, trying to spot some light, some sign of land, but there was only the vastness of the ocean and the fury of the storm. At dawn, the storm finally began to subside. The wind lessened, and the gigantic waves gave way to a rough but manageable sea. The sun, still shy, began to appear on the horizon, revealing the devastation. There was no sign of the other ships in the fleet. El Sueño de Castilla had completely disappeared, taking with it its valuable treasure and the truth of what had truly happened. However, as daylight brightened, Don Alejandro spotted a piece of wood floating near the boat. He pulled it in and, to his surprise, realized it was a fragment of El Sueño de Castilla's deck. Attached to it, soaked, was a piece of parchment. With trembling hands, he unrolled the paper. It was a map, the same map Mateo had tried to save. Although damaged by water, Don Alejandro managed to identify an alternative route, marked with an X at a specific point. Despite the exhaustion and the pain of loss, a new determination ignited in Don Alejandro. He knew that map was the key to unraveling the mystery. The treasure fleet had sunk, but the secret of its destruction could still be revealed. He looked at Captain Ramirez, who observed him with a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. The journey was far from over. If you're immersed in this story of shipwrecks and secrets, don't miss the next chapters. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to be alerted. The days that followed were a testament to human resilience. Adrift in the vast ocean, the small group of survivors clung to the hope of rescue. They rationed their meager supplies of water and hardtack, their bodies growing weaker with each passing hour. Don Alejandro, despite his own suffering, used his knowledge of navigation to try and determine their approximate location, even with their damaged instruments. Captain Ramirez, though gravely injured from the shipwreck, remained a beacon of strength, encouraging the others and sharing what little he knew of the currents and winds. One afternoon, as despair began to set in, a distant speck appeared on the horizon. It grew steadily larger until it became clear, a small fishing vessel, a falucho, its single lateen sail billowing in the breeze. The relief that washed over the survivors was palpable. They screamed, waved their arms, and miraculously the fishermen spotted them. The fishermen, simple but kind-hearted folk from a small coastal village in Andalusia, took them aboard. They provided fresh water, food, and rudimentary medical care. Don Alejandro, weak but determined, explained their plight, omitting the details of the suspected betrayal for now. He showed them the tattered map fragment. The fishermen, with their deep understanding of the local waters, recognized the marked location. It was a notoriously treacherous area, known for hidden reefs and strong currents, far from the established shipping lanes. Back on land, in a rustic inn in the quiet fishing village, Don Alejandro began to formulate a plan. He knew he had to report to the Crown, but first he needed to investigate the location marked on the map. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shipwreck was no accident, and that the treasure, or at least its true fate, lay at that specific spot. Captain Ramirez, slowly recovering, confirmed his suspicions. He had also observed Mateo's suspicious behavior and the heated argument in the map room. Don Alejandro, with the support of Captain Ramirez, managed to convince the head fisherman, an old salt named Pedro, to help him. Pedro, intrigued by the mystery and recognizing the potential reward if any treasure was indeed recovered, agreed to take Don Alejandro back to the coordinates on the map. They would need a sturdier vessel and more supplies, but the determination in Don Alejandro's eyes was infectious. He knew the journey would be perilous and that the depths of the ocean held more than just sunken gold. They held the answers to a conspiracy. The map, now a symbol of both disaster and discovery, was his guiding light. Armed with a sturdy fishing boat, provisions, and a small, dedicated crew, including Pedro and his 2 sons, Don Alejandro set sail once more. The journey back to the marked coordinates was somber. The sea, though calm now, held the memory of the recent tempest and the tragedy it had brought. Don Alejandro felt a knot in his stomach, a mixture of anticipation and dread. He was returning to the grave of El Sueño de Castilla. As they neared the coordinates, the ocean floor began to rise, indicated by the changing color of the water. Pedro pointed to a barely submerged reef, a jagged finger of rock lurking just beneath the surface. "This is it, Don Alejandro," he said, his voice low. "Many ships have met their end here, even on clear days. It's a place the old ones call the Tooth of the Dragon." Don Alejandro confirmed the location against his salvaged map fragment. This was indeed the spot. The treachery of Mateo, intentionally steering the fleet towards this known hazard, was now painfully clear. The storm had merely provided the perfect cover. Don Alejandro prepared his diving equipment, which was rudimentary for the time: a heavy diving bell, lead weights, and a rudimentary air pump operated by Pedro's sons. The air was supplied via a hose to the bell, allowing for limited time underwater. It was a dangerous endeavor, but the answers lay beneath the waves. With a deep breath, Don Alejandro descended into the silent, cold embrace of the ocean. The light from the surface quickly faded, replaced by an eerie twilight. The pressure began to build around him, a constant reminder of the crushing forces of the deep. He peered through the small, thick glass window of the diving bell, searching for any sign of the wreck. Suddenly, a massive, shadowy form emerged from the gloom. It was the El Sueño de Castilla, resting on its side, a ghostly skeleton of its former glory. Its wooden hull was torn open, revealing gaping wounds where the reef had struck. Debris littered the seabed around it, broken masts, scattered barrels, and the chilling sight of human bones. The sheer scale of the disaster was overwhelming, a stark reminder of the lives lost. As he slowly moved along the wreck, his heart pounding, Don Alejandro spotted something glinting amidst the wreckage. It was a strongbox, partially buried in the sand. He directed the crew above to lower a grappling hook. The retrieval was slow and arduous, but eventually the strongbox was brought to the surface. It was heavy, sealed, and covered in barnacles. Don Alejandro knew that its contents might hold crucial evidence, but more importantly, he felt a deeper, unsettling truth beginning to surface. The disaster was not just an act of nature, but a calculated, murderous plot. Back on the fishing boat, under the harsh glare of the midday sun, Don Alejandro carefully pried open the barnacle-encrusted strongbox. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several documents and a small, ornate dagger. The documents were official manifests and ledgers, detailing the exact cargo of gold, silver, and precious stones carried by El Sueño de Castilla. But what truly caught Don Alejandro's eye was a crumpled, water-stained letter tucked beneath the manifests. He carefully unfolded it. The script was hurried, almost frantic, but legible. It was a letter from Mateo to an unknown recipient detailing the plot, the intentional diversion of the fleet to the Tooth of the Dragon Reef during the storm, ensuring the El Sueño de Castilla would be the first to strike, creating chaos and providing a distraction while Mateo and his co-conspirators made their escape with a portion of the most valuable cargo, which they had secretly preloaded onto specific smaller vessels within the fleet. The letter even mentioned a meeting point on a secluded island further west, where they would rendezvous with another ship to transfer the stolen treasure. The dagger was just as telling. Its hilt bore a distinct, intricate crest, the emblem of a powerful, albeit lesser-known noble family with ties to the Spanish court, a family known for its ambition and ruthlessness. This was not just a simple act of piracy. It was a conspiracy involving individuals with influence. Don Alejandro's mind raced. Mateo had not intended for the entire fleet to be lost, just the flagship, to create the diversion. The storm had been fiercer than anticipated, however, and had swept away the other ships as well, turning a calculated heist into a catastrophic disaster. The map, the strongbox, the letter, the dagger, they all formed an undeniable chain of evidence. The treasure fleet disaster was, in fact, a premeditated act of mass murder and grand theft, covered by the fury of nature. Pedro and his sons, listening intently as Don Alejandro translated the key parts of the letter, gasped. The scale of the treachery was astounding. "This changes everything," Pedro whispered, his weathered face grim. "The crown must be informed immediately." Don Alejandro knew the dangers involved. Accusing a noble family would be fraught with peril, but the truth had to be revealed. He looked out at the vast, indifferent ocean, knowing that the El Sueño de Castilla had not merely been lost to the sea, but sacrificed. He had found the treasure, not of gold and jewels, but of truth, and it was far more valuable. You've unearthed a crucial piece of the puzzle. If you're hooked on this historical mystery, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion. With the strongbox and its damning contents secured, Don Alejandro and his small crew began the perilous journey back to Cartagena. The return trip was filled with a new kind of tension. They were no longer just survivors. They were guardians of a dark secret, and Don Alejandro knew that the conspirators would stop at nothing to silence them if they knew the truth had been uncovered. They sailed mostly at night, hugging the coastline, avoiding established shipping routes where they might encounter anyone who could be connected to Mateo's network. Pedro, with his lifetime of experience navigating these waters, proved invaluable, skillfully guiding the boat through hidden coves and treacherous channels. Don Alejandro spent his days studying the letter, memorizing every detail and planning his approach to the authorities. He knew he couldn't trust just anyone. The conspiracy might reach higher than he imagined. Upon reaching a small, remote port, Don Alejandro entrusted the strongbox to Pedro, instructing him to guard it with his life and to deliver it only to a specific, trusted official in Cartagena should anything happen to him. He then set off on horseback, taking a more direct and faster route inland, aiming for Cartagena de Indias. The journey was arduous. He faced rough terrain, unpredictable weather, and the constant fear of being followed. He slept little, his mind replaying the scenes of the shipwreck and the treachery he had uncovered. He thought of the innocent lives lost, the families devastated by the disaster, and his resolve hardened. Justice, however slow and dangerous, must be served. After several days of relentless travel, Don Alejandro finally reached the outskirts of Cartagena. The city, vibrant and bustling, seemed indifferent to the tragedy that had occurred at sea. He made his way directly to the residence of Don Ricardo de Silva, a respected admiral and a man known for his integrity, a contact he had been given by his trusted mentor in Madrid. Don Ricardo, a stern-faced man with sharp eyes, listened patiently as Don Alejandro recounted the entire story, the secret mission, the suspicions of betrayal, the storm, the shipwreck, the discovery of the strongbox, and the horrifying contents of Mateo's letter. As Don Alejandro laid out the evidence, the map, the letter, the dagger with its distinctive crest, Don Ricardo's expression grew increasingly grave. He recognized the crest immediately. "This is a grave accusation, Don Alejandro," Don Ricardo said, his voice low and serious. "The family named in this letter holds great power." "The truth holds greater power, Admiral," Don Alejandro countered, his voice steady. He knew he had taken an irreversible step, but there was no turning back. The path to justice was fraught with danger, but the buried truth of the Spanish treasure fleet disaster had finally been brought to light. The revelation of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of Spanish colonial society. Don Ricardo de Silva, a man of unwavering principles, immediately understood the gravity of Don Alejandro's findings. He moved swiftly and discreetly, gathering a small, loyal team of investigators. The evidence was irrefutable. The recovered map fragment matching official charts, the detailed manifest of the El Sueño de Castilla, and most damning, Mateo's letter explicitly outlining the plot to sabotage the fleet, along with the distinct crest on the dagger. The family implicated, the Marqués de Velasco, was indeed powerful, with deep roots in the court and extensive commercial interests. Their influence was vast, and many hesitated to challenge them. However, Don Ricardo, aided by Don Alejandro's detailed testimony and his first-hand account of the shipwreck, prepared a watertight case. The first step was to discreetly apprehend Mateo and his known accomplices. This proved to be challenging. Some had managed to escape the shipwreck, but others, stranded and desperate, were eventually tracked down. Under intense interrogation and presented with the undeniable evidence of the letter, some of them broke, confirming Don Alejandro's account and providing further details about the Marqués de Velasco's involvement. The Marqués, it turned out, had orchestrated the plot to steal a substantial portion of the fleet's most valuable cargo, planning to sell it on the black market to consolidate his family's waning power and influence. The shipwreck was a tragic yet convenient cover for his grand larceny. The confrontation with the Marqués de Velasco was tense. Don Alejandro stood by Don Ricardo's side as the evidence was presented. The Marqués, initially defiant and arrogant, paled as Mateo's letter was read aloud, his family crest on the dagger staring back at him like an accusation. The weight of the evidence, combined with the testimony of his former accomplices, left him no room for denial. The scandal was immense, shaking the very foundations of trust within the Spanish elite. The consequences were swift and severe. The Marqués de Velasco and his co-conspirators were arrested, their assets seized. The news spread like wildfire throughout Spain and its colonies, a stark reminder that even the most powerful could not escape justice. While the treasure itself remained at the bottom of the ocean, the truth of its loss had been recovered, a far more significant find. Don Alejandro, now hailed as a national hero, was lauded for his courage and dedication. He had not only uncovered a conspiracy, but had also provided a measure of closure to the families who had lost loved ones in the disaster. The Spanish treasure fleet disaster would forever be remembered not as an act of God, but as a testament to human greed and the enduring pursuit of truth. Years passed. Don Alejandro Vargas, no longer just a young, ambitious archaeologist, became a celebrated figure in Spain. His work revolutionized maritime archaeology, emphasizing not just the recovery of artifacts, but the meticulous investigation of historical events. He established new protocols for underwater exploration, always with a deep respect for the lost lives and the stories submerged beneath the waves. The Tooth of the Dragon Reef was mapped in detail, becoming a cautionary tale for all navigators. The recovered strongbox, with Mateo's letter and the Marqués de Velasco's dagger, became a permanent exhibit in the Royal Museum in Madrid, a chilling reminder of the conspiracy and the human cost of greed. The official narrative of the Spanish treasure fleet disaster was rewritten, acknowledging the treachery that had played a significant role in its tragic end. Don Alejandro continued his work, but his focus shifted. He no longer sought just gold and jewels, but the hidden truths of history. He believed that every shipwreck, every archaeological site, held a story waiting to be told, a puzzle waiting to be solved. He traveled extensively, leading expeditions, mentoring new generations of archaeologists, and advocating for the preservation of underwater heritage. Captain Ramirez, after a full recovery, retired from the sea, his trust in humanity shaken but not broken. He became a close friend and confidant of Don Alejandro, often sharing stories of the sea and offering his unique perspective on maritime history. He carried the scars of the shipwreck, but also the peace of knowing that the truth had prevailed. The El Sueño de Castilla and its treasure remained largely untouched at the bottom of the ocean, a monument to the greed that had sealed its fate. Don Alejandro occasionally revisited the site, descending into the silent depths. He would reflect on the ironies of fate, how a quest for treasure had led him to uncover a crime, and how the vastness of the ocean could both conceal and reveal the darkest secrets of humanity. The disaster was a stark reminder that while the sea could be a formidable adversary, the most dangerous forces often lay within the hearts of men. The story of the Spanish treasure fleet disaster became a powerful legacy, teaching future generations about the perils of ambition and the enduring power of truth, a story brought to light by an archaeologist who dared to look beyond the glittering gold and into the shadowed depths of history. And so concludes the thrilling tale of the Spanish treasure fleet, the submerged secret. If you were captivated by this journey into history and mystery, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more incredible stories to life.